at the end of the day, they have to meet their financial obligations. If you buy a steelworks on credit, you have to pay the principal and the interest every day, and so you need to be producing steel. Those your investments are just trickling away. And so there was this weird situation, he says, where it was cheaper to produce things for which there was no market than to produce nothing at all.
This is pop. Yeah, yeah. This is pop, pop.
This is Diet Soap. I'm here with Daniel Burnfin, and he is a member of Class Unity, and he's participated recently in a couple of Platypus Affiliated Society panels, most recently at the International Convention in Chicago. I reached out to him after his contribution in a panel called Class and the Left, which was, I think, last year maybe. But today we're finally getting to talk, and I wanted to talk to him about the discussion he took part in Chicago, namely the panel. And the topic on the panel was called "What is Leadership for the Left?" But Daniel, just to start with, thanks for coming on to the Diet Soap podcast.
Thank you.
And I should point out again that not Zero Books related. That's all in the past. So, so I wanted to start with just pointing out kind of what happened with you on the panel in Chicago.
Sure.
This was a discussion of what kind of leadership was needed on the left.
Mm-hmm.
And you thought the question of leadership had to be framed around the question of what needed to be done,
Mm-hmm.
or what would be required in order to overcome capitalist relations.
Mm-hmm.
You started out by distinguishing between what maybe Moishe Pistone might have called traditional Marxism and a more esoteric Marxism. You said that for Marx, revolution meant revolutionizing the mode of production, or the way we produce things. However, I wonder if capital itself doesn't continually revolutionize production. And
Mm-hmm.
I want to start by asking you what would be different about a Marxist attempt to revolutionize production as opposed to the way that capitalists do all the time.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so yeah, I wanted to frame the question in terms of what can be done and who can do it. And I wanted to sort of insist that these are empirical questions, which will be determined and explained by the economic situation we're in. That suggestion met quite a bit of resistance because I think people thought I meant I was advocating something like empiricism or positivism or some sort of specific ideology like that. No, I just mean matters of fact in the world. The way the economy is will decide, for instance, which sectors of the economy are particularly have a lot of conflict in them or present opportunities for disrupting capital strikes and so forth. Any number of things, but the fact is you have to look. And so the distinction I wanted to draw was, so Moishe Pistone distinguishes traditional Marxism. That can be helpful, but certainly I would hope that it wouldn't get more esoteric. What I want to distinguish is traditional Marxism in the sense of the isms, maybe like Trotskyism or Leninism or whatever, name your favorite. And a kind of Marxism which is in tune with what is going on in the world right now, empirical facts, explanations, namely, above all, the economic situation. And so Marxists are quick to say, what has to be done? Well, we have to take ownership and control of capital, perhaps, and who's going to do it? The working class. On the one hand, that's true, obviously. On another hand, it's so general that it's not particularly helpful. So I was hoping that we would get more concrete and more in tune with what's going on in the economy. I mean, if Marxism is nothing if not an economic explanation of society, and yet, many self-designating Marxists neglect that aspect and just want to make it all about politics. So one example of the opposite of what I would want to see, I think part of the question in the prompt in the discussion was who should lead. And I've heard people say things like the most oppressed and the most victimized need to be the ones who lead the emancipatory struggle. That would be a perfect example, I think, of an outlook on politics which is not concerned with winning. It's not concerned with understanding the world sufficiently that it can act effectively and succeed. It's
Hmm.
concerned with being the good guy, doing the right thing, having clean hands, whatever. But if we want to change the world, we have to understand it first. Um, and so,
Hmm.
who can act and what can they do? These are questions of fact. These aren't. You can't consult Trotsky for the answer for this. You know what I mean?
Hmm. I felt like I kind of felt your pain as I watched the panel unfold. Like I kept I always was finding myself cheering you on. Um
Thanks.
and at the same time I was a little befuddled by the reaction from people who I consider to be very smart Marxists. Like Spencer Leonard was sitting right in front of me. He's our future editor at Sublation Magazine. He's one of the co-founders of the Platypus Affiliated Society, and I felt as though there was a misreading of what you were saying, or people were mishearing what you were saying, in a way that was a little surprising. Although I could see how it was colored by their interpretive lenses. Like there was a certain adherence to Adorno within the Platypus Affiliated Society,
Mhm.
and a concern about positivism. But just to clarify, what Adorno was talking about and why we should be wary of positivism or pure empiricism, I want to express what that critique is and tell me if you
Sure,
think this is correct.
sure.
So the the problem with positivism, as Adorno sees it, especially in the social sciences, is that it approaches the world as if it is fixed, as if just like the world of physical objects that might be composed of atoms, what we're looking to do is discover universal laws, facts which arise from some substrata of reality, which is outside of us, which we don't shape and which we don't participate in, which we are simply discovering. The world as it is something to be discovered um to be understood. But our relationship with that world is one is a mere observer.
Mhm.
We're lucky enough to have, by some fluke, been brought into a universe that has really nothing to do with us, and we're trying to discover what its laws are, the natural laws of the world. And when you approach social sciences like that, what you're doing is treating humanity as if it has an innate nature, as if it has a structure which can be determined the same way we can determine the structure of an atom. And therefore, you are put into a conservative position, and you're overlooking your own responsibility and power to change or shape what you might call like social ontology.
Mhm.
Um, so, so anyway, that's the critique of positivism as I understand it from Adorno. Maybe that's too simplistic. But why do you think it is that when you ask for people to look at the empirical facts, that they heard you saying something along the lines of like, what are the limits of possibility based on what we know of, I don't know, the
Uh,
sources of energy in the world, or how much food can be grown, or is that
mhm.
what they're
I
hearing
see,
you
I
say?
see, I see. Okay, yeah. So I see why now. I see the connection. So maybe there was some resistance to the idea of asking the question, "What is possible as a matter of fact, and who can do it?" Because that sounds like something that we've all learned is bad from reading Adorno. Yeah, 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 yeah. And I see what you mean now, and I think that's probably true. Um, I would say so. It's important. I think so. Positivism gets a really bad rap, and I'd say it's important to remember. If people who read Adorno or people who are educated in the humanities get a certain version of positivism, the bad guy, and that's situated in a debate from the early part of the 20th century. With that situation is no longer there. These people no longer exist. The positivists themselves said, what we wanted to do wasn't tenable. It wasn't sustainable. Basically, the view was you have immediate sense data decide whether your propositions are true or false, right? And so we don't have any fancy, rich theory. We don't have theory-laden experience. We have pure experience, and it just tells us what's the case. And of course, that's naive and it doesn't work. And they were some of the first people to admit that. The
Mm.
problem with that, as I see it, is that for Marxists, is that social relations are not directly observable. That view will want to point at individual entities, and it will find, things, and then you'll say, yeah, but what about capital? What about value? What about the changing composition of capital through the accumulation of capital and the effects that it can have in politics? And then the problem would be there, yeah, this isn't observable. We can't point to that. You'd have to give a pretty sophisticated, I mean, maybe you could argue that it's observable, but at least my understanding is the rub there was that social relations are not directly observable because they're manifest through things. As Marx says, it's a social relation between things and material relations between persons. That's the way we experience society in capitalism, which is kind of inverted world. So yeah, I can understand that resistance, but what is actually being resisted? I would say in that case, Adorno is functioning like Trotsky might for a Trot sect, right? He says positivism is bad, and we like him. And I don't mean this, I'm not trying to play too rough or be disrespectful, but um, our first commitment has to be to understanding the way the world is. We don't. There are obvious reasons to dislike positivism, but understanding the way the world is about understanding facts. And facts are independent of our will, and they're independent of our intellect in some sense. And so, if you don't accept that, then you basically think you can just will whatever into existence, or by wishful thinking you can make something happen, and that is just a formula for disaster. So we have to be able to accept that the facts are independent of our will, and not worry about this positivism stuff. I mean, that's a rather academic, esoteric debate. I would encourage we simplify things, and we just try to understand, what's going on in the economy, and for example, uh, 2% of GDP flows right outside of Chicago. If those warehouse workers were unionized, you could put pressure on that and you could really shut things down. You need to know that information in order to know what to do and where. And
Mm.
so I'm not worried about positivism, and no one else is either, except for some people who read critical theory. Um,
Right. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Well, just to stay on this topic of positivism in a sense a little longer, um, one of the points about Marxism is that uh, the well, two things. Well, one is I want to say that this notion that you raised in your panel in the panel discussion was that Marx talks about social ontology, right? And uh, the there are two parts to that. There's the being, there's the ontology, there's what is, and then there's the social aspect of it, right? So you were saying that the facts about the world are outside of us or apart from us, but I would say only temporally so. Like in other words, only through a process of us acting, having a will, having a subjectivity, making attempts to alter the world, and then discovering like a bunch of unintended consequences after the fact. You know, so like even within capitalism, you can there have been changes that have been made through acts of politics and will, like the change away from Fordism into neoliberalism was a fairly consciously done project. Um, even though it was a reactive one, I think,
okay.
reacting to the economic crisis. So, um, so when you this is how you can start to bring politics back in to not it wouldn't be necessarily politics first, but it would be we are responsible for changing the conditions that we'll then be responsible for reacting to. Um, so yeah, knowing where the flow of goods are is important. Also knowing where they can take it if we do try to lock down a port in Chicago, or have, if we get a unionized shop, what their options are would be probably a good thing to know. And even more important than that is knowing why we'd want to slow the flow of goods.
Right.
Under what circumstances would that be even the smart thing to do?
Right.
So yeah, I'm with you all along the line there, but I just want to reiterate that I think that what people on around me are chafing at is this idea that there's an economic realm that operates completely independently of the political realm, and of course Marx's critique was a critique of political economy. But anyway, I'll just let you respond to what I've
Sure.
been saying.
Sure. So going back a second, I guess this kind of connects to the previous question. I'd want to say you can be a realist without being a positivist. So a
Right.
positivist is concerned with like immediate sense data. It's kind of really reductive, crude empiricism. A realist just says that matters of fact um, are what they are, independent of the way you'd rather have them be. And now I see your point in this context. So we could say natural facts might be fully independent of our action, but social facts, they certainly aren't completely independent of our action. On the contrary, they're constituted by our social interactions, and we're involved in them. We constitute them in a sense. They are the unintended consequences of human interaction, and so therefore it might seem like a mistake to regard these things as facts which have to be explained because they're, after all, consequences of our interaction. On the one hand, that's true, and so I think like the original impetus of critical theory in that essay by Horkheimer, traditional and critical theory. That was one thing he emphasized there. Like, unlike the natural sciences, Marxism, and the social sciences, we're not dealing with a object which is external to the observer. The observer is somehow inside the object, and so we have different relation. Fair enough. I mean, critical theory was also used just as a code word for Marxism until it finally lost all of its Marxist content.
Right.
But I would say, nevertheless,
that day has not happened yet. I exist. I exist to continue the tradition of using critical theory when I mean Marxism. But go on.
I don't know. When I see critical theory stuff go on now, it's mostly like Habermasian stuff, which is the absolute death of Marxism.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. But nonetheless, sublation media exists. We're back.
Okay.
We're back, baby. Keep going. Keep
breathing life into the was it Marx said capital's a vampire, and the more it sucks, the more it needs. I'm not sure. Critical theory is going to need a lot of blood. So
okay.
I think nevertheless, because social facts are constituted by human interaction, they're unintended consequences of human interaction. We can still explain them the way we would explain any other kind of fact. I mean, Durkheim coins this phrase social fact, and he says, this isn't the same as a natural fact, but it's still a fact, and it still has to be explained. So economy is a perfect case there. You have some kind of complex emergent order. We have to understand it. And indeed, it's not like, it's not like the inverse square law. It's not something from physics, but it's not something we will. No one wants this. No one wants this. What we have is an outcome of a chaotic interaction of wills and individual actions. And no one asked for this, and yet we have it, and we're all responsible for it. So we have to explain it in order to be able to act effectively, I'd say. I mean, this is pretty straightforward stuff. What I'd want to say about social ontology, right, the ontology part and the social part, just simply by ontology, I think what I was trying to say in the panel was that, class for Marxism, as contrasted to liberalism, class is an economic concept. Classes are defined by the functions that individuals perform in a system of social production of surplus value and reproduction. What kind of being you are, that's what ontology is about, That will be determined, so the categories, that will be determined by the functions of the system as it reproduces itself. Liberals, on the other hand, think that, classes are basically just groups of individuals, and we can form a class, like, oh, we're the Village Green Appreciation Society. We come together to advocate for the Village Green or whatever. And that's obviously a totally different concept. But, the point is that for Marxism, class is an economic concept, and that provides your social ontology. Namely, in a society, what do you have? You have workers. You have capitalists, commercial and industrial, financial. You have rentiers. Basically, three kinds of things. Landlords. You have three kinds of beings. And what determines that? The structure of the economy. No one chose this. Everyone was born into this. We choose how we go forward, but we don't choose our circumstances. And so, as you said, if we understand the circumstances, we might be able to change them so that we'll have some control over the conditions in which we choose going forward. Right. I wouldn't want to completely get rid of agency and say it's all structure, but certainly won't be any agency that makes any intentional difference if we don't understand structure. And I'd also like to say, for a really hardcore Marxian picture, subjectivity and agency, these are products of structure.
Right.
There is no natural individual subject. I mean, we are essentially social creatures.
Right. I agree with that entirely. And I would say that the individualism of liberalism, if it's going to endure, will have to endure by liberalism being transformed into socialism. I'll say something just like assert that, without a justification right off the bat. But I do think that you're right, that the kind of individual freedom that sort of warps the way we view the situation, when sometimes warps Marxism, is also a product of capital, and it's one of the benefits of capitalist society, I think.
Liberty is pretty cool.
Yeah. So now you said something really interesting in this panel discussion, and I do think that it's important to listen carefully when you're at one of these panels and to try to give it the most charitable reading to what people say as possible, because it's often off the cuff comments, and sometimes you can watch a speaker switch tracks. Like they're going down one track and then they go down and then they switch over to something else altogether. So like what you said was that Marxists had a different conception of revolution than maybe earlier socialists had. That Marx, as he developed, changed his definition of what revolution was from a strictly political kind of revolution to one where that structure of society would be altered, right? But you also then went on to say that revolutionaries have to increase productivity. That you said you can take power in a state as long as you can increase profitability. And this increase in profitability, increase in production, the increase in the power of capital, really, through entrepreneurship and free competition, was what set the course of 19th century and maybe early 20th century Marxists. That is what the revolution was aimed at. And you question as to whether or not we should be aimed at that today. Was that what was increasing profitability Marx's own view of what revolution should be, given that he, after he decided he wanted to change the structure of society, was unfettering the realm of production, how Marx thought the structure of society would be changed?
Right. Yes, there are two things going on, and I kind of rolled them together in that comment. So the traditional Marxian picture that you get like in the preface to the Contribution to Critique of Political Economy is like the definitive statement of historical materialism. It's like the most cited passage in Marx. That it is not the consciousness of men that determines their humans that determines their social being. Rather, the social being determines their consciousness. And it goes on to talk about economic structure, the real foundation, and then the sort of juridico-political ideological superstructure. In that model, the point is that you have the forces of production which capitalists will develop, or capitalists have developed, as though there were no limit. produce as much as you can, get as much as you can. And then you, on the other hand, you have the relations of production. We could say the market and effective demand, how much the market can actually absorb. And you'll have, there's not necessarily a sync between production and or supply and consumption and demand. And you have turbulence. There's not an automatic equilibrium like you have in orthodox economics. And so he put that into a broader historical context, not just capitalism, but basically whoever can produce more, better, manage society more efficiently will sort of outcompete, outstrip the leadership at any given point, render them obsolete and redundant, put them out of a job. And so the dynamics of taking and keeping power in history was meant to be determined by the dynamics of productivity generally. And so the whether that holds after the 19th century sort of end of laissez-faire is a question that Marxists should ask. The dawn of the monopoly capitalist or financial imperialist capitalist era, that's something Marxists should think about. There's a real difference drawn there between about 1870 and to the First World War. But on your point about profit, the theorist I had in the back of my mind there was Alfred Sohn-Rethel, and he has a book called Economy and Class Structure of German Fascism. And I'd recommend it. It's more interesting. It's interesting even if you're not particularly just interested in fascism or Germany or the European economy in the 20th century. He had a concept there called the social reconsolidation of capitalism. And that was what was in the back of my mind. And basically, what he's saying is like, after World War I in Germany, the social democrats, who before the war were supposed to be the socialists, the radical revolutionaries, they actually turned out to be the sort of unwitting or perhaps witting, Ebert was a pretty reformist guy, henchmen of capital. They were doing the bidding and they were allowed to steer. Normally they'd be like the baby in the passenger seat with the make-believe steering wheel that's not connected to anything.
Yeah.
But they were very popular. So the rentier capitalist class said, "All right, you can steer, but you better do it so that it works, right?" And so they were allowed to hold power for a while. We all know how that ended. Sohn-Rethel's point is also that the Nazi fascists were lifted into power by industrialists and finance in order to restore profitability, which was, it wasn't working. They were in danger of losing all their fixed capital investments. And so you could update this to today, I think. I was just fishing around for some contemporary examples, and they're not perfect, but it's a good illustration. In 2008, around the time of the global financial crisis, you had Sarkozy in France saying, laissez-faire, that's finished. That's a quote. David Cameron in the UK said, while we may be fiscal conservatives, we are monetary radicals injecting money into the system. And so quantitative easing now in the financialized, it's been financialized for a while. This isn't new. But QE, the way that they're getting trigger happy with it, that's to say just constant currency creation to bail out insolvent, illiquid financial institutions. That seems to be kind of new. And that's a case where, you can keep power if you abide and preserve profitability. I think you brought up the example of neoliberalism. After about 30 years of Keynesian economic policy, which tried to make sure that we had full employment and managed capital investment in an industrial way rather than a sort of financial way, or primarily financial way, you had unemployment and inflation. Okay, so who can take power? The ones who can restore profitability. What was neoliberalism? It was a class project to restore profitability for the class of absentee-owning capitalists, the rentiers. And so I would say, in general, the Marxist thesis is that the decisive factor for taking and holding power is about who can best manage the system, outcompete their opponents. Specifically within capitalism, you can take power if you can restore profitability. So
Right.
It's sort of general in a particular case.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I would maybe object to like the pre-capitalist order running along those lines, because I feel like it might also have to do with if you can align with scripture or something beforehand. Like if you could give people the sense that they were part of a holy project, if in religious in times where religion really was shaping society, that you could deal with quite a lot of death and destruction and famine, with a pretty powerful ideological cover. But that's just, I'm not a historian. That's just my
Me
speculation.
neither. Me neither.
Right. Um, but I will say, on the question of profitability, what was Alfred Stone Rathel's? I'll ask, what was his? Why was it that profitability was so essential for maintaining power? Like, why did whether that the leader was a fascist or a social democrat or some sort of moderate liberal, why was it so important that whoever they were, whatever their ideology was, that they served to put into place policies that would maximize or revive profitability? What gave that such political saliency?
Um, um, well, I just going back 1 second.
I mean,
Something
it
you said.
seems obvious, like right on this, like why do we need to explain this? But I feel
No,
like
no,
we
no,
should
no.
explain
That's
it.
a good question. It's a good question. It's important. At least I think. At least I agree that it's important. But I just want
Mhm.
to back up 1 second. It could be, like you said, maybe this story is wrong about the general historical stuff. It could be that the historical materialist picture that Marx presents is more of a sort of myth narrative than actual historical explanatory framework. I would just separate the economics and the general historical theory. All we need to do is understand the way the world is. I'm not so deeply invested in whether or not that research program is true or false. You may be right, it may be wrong, but it's an evolutionary picture, and the facts will decide. So
Right.
again, so then why profitability? Well, I would in the case, I'll just stick with the Son Rathel's example. So his point was basically so after, I think it's chapter 27 of volume 3 of Capital, Marx sketches the beginning of a. So Engels made sure it ended up in there, but it was kind of outlier in the theory because Marx is generally talking about competitive capitalism. He's sort of taking the idealized model, like, okay, when capitalism works, how does it work? Um, that doesn't usually include monopoly or trusts or so forth, but Marx does. He does bring that up, and that ends up in volume 3. And he says, basically, you get a different picture than you had in the manifesto. Like in the manifesto, which most of traditional Marxism is based on, you have a sort of simplistic dichotomy of capitalists and workers. Right? You got two classes. And then he says, oh, well, around 1870. Things started to change a little bit. You start to have joint stock holding companies and traded firms, and it becomes financialized, and so you get a different picture. The capitalists cease to be the ones who wield power. He says the capitalist becomes an absentee owner, the shareholder, and the entrepreneur becomes manager of other people's capital. So now you have capitalist managers and the working class. And so you have a
And this
class.
is Rathel that we're talking about, not Marx, right?
This is Marx, I believe, chapter 27, volume 3. But you
Okay.
won't find as much of that in Marx as you find in later Marxists who developed this this view, Hilferding, um, the monopoly capitalist school, so like Baran and Sweezy and so forth. But
Hmm.
the point is just that capitalists need someone to manage their capital investments. So Son Rethel then, he's basically saying, in interwar period uh, Weimar Germany, this is only radicalized. You have capitalists who have massive investments in fixed capital in Germany. So what does that mean? Namely, like steel plants, massive ironworks, all of these things made for heavy industrial production. Obviously, they're not producing it. It's all been sort of dialed down. It's massively under capacity. The utilization of it was very low, but they invested so much capital in it because when you have a bigger scale, you get a lower cost per unit. So they tried to make it as massive as possible to cut their costs and increase their profits. But then the post-war situation rolls around, and they're not producing. They're not able to produce. So they need to basically throw off all the limitations. I mean, they have to. At the end of the day, they have to meet their financial obligations. If you buy a steelworks on credit, you have to pay the principal and the interest every day, and so you need to be producing steel. Those your investments are just trickling away. And so there was this weird situation, he says, where it was cheaper to produce things for which there was no market than to produce nothing at all, because you can't just turn a steelworks off, right? You have to keep working. It'll break if you turn it off. You have to keep it going, and that's an investment they didn't want to lose. So they had an incentive and a motivation to find a way to bend the market to their supply and their production. There was no market for steel.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you do when the market doesn't want your steel? Well, one way to sell steel is to make bullets. So if you're not going to lose all those investments, you have to find some way to create an artificial demand for steel. Obviously, workers can't consume steel. You can't eat bullets, but you can shoot them. And the only way that you can keep selling more bullets is to keep shooting them. And so there was something like imperialism, which had internalized into Europe and cannibalized it, basically, is his view.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a case where it's very clear that the financial, political, economic situation was what pushed the capitalist class of absentee owners to find authoritarian, violent henchmen who would restore their profitability.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that makes it sound as though the reason why you need to restore profitability if you're going to maintain power is strictly because in order to serve capital, maybe not even the capitalist class, this is what needs to be done. In other words, in order to maintain the steelworks, but also in order to, you know, maintain the capitalists or their managers or the institutions of power that develop around capital. But what about the workers? I mean, what about what about the citizenry? Don't you also have to maintain profitability in order to keep them from rebelling? Would that be another aspect of why profitability is key under capitalism in order to maintain quiescence?
Yeah, there's another pair of theorists that are valuable there or helpful there. I think so. This is, if it's not a matter of interesting Marxist theory, but a matter of whether these theories actually describe the world, someone would know better than me. But
Right.
because ultimately it's true or it's false. But what you're saying, as far as I understand and know, reminds me of Baron and Sweezy's Monopoly Capital, and they're talking about a period like, so written in 1966. They're talking about a period which is ways after what Soenraethel was talking about, and they're saying basically we have a different problem now. We have so much surplus which is produced. We actually have more surplus than we have profitable reinvestment opportunities, and we have to find ways to spend it. It's like a hot potato. You don't want to get stuck with it, because it has to keep being reinvested and reproduced. And so you have things like management um, exploding everywhere into administration. You have the sales effort and marketing. You've got militarism. You've got the Cold War. Soenraethel also talked about that. The Cold War is a continuation of the fascist economy, state spending. So the way this relates to what you're saying is basically just, like you need to create sufficient surplus, that every human being on earth could basically work 2 hours a day. But instead, you make them all work 12 hours a day. And in fact, some of them are still unemployed, but you give them bullshit jobs just to keep them busy. And so that book by Graeber, he talks about this invention of busy work to keep us distracted from, doing political activity and organizing. Yes, I think sustaining the production of surplus in order to keep people busy with bullshit jobs, that could be a political strategy to keep power in the hands of certain people. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to go back to my prepared questions, but let's see. Well, I'm gonna kind of return to this because you just said something that I wanted as a orthodox Marxist, and therefore by extension some sort of quasi Hegelian. I want to push upon a little bit, which you said, when it comes to social facts, they're either true or they're false, right? And the Hegelian perspective would be, well, for something to be true, the negative of it has to be attained as well, right? There's something to be present, its own negation is implied in its existence, or something like that. So when it comes to quiescence of the general population, that's maintained through maintaining profitability, um, one of the things I would want to point out is that the lack of quiescence might not need to be sufficient in order to cause a socialist revolution, in order for capitalists still to be driven to maintain profitability in order to hold on to their own power as within the capitalist system. Like, um, like a lot of times people will try to explain why the working class hasn't risen up and overthrown capitalist relations
Right.
based on this idea that they haven't been sufficiently immiserated
Mm-hmm.
for it to be in their interest to really take that risk, right? But you don't have to think that is the case in order to think that maintaining profitability is the only way to hold on to power for the bourgeois politician who wants to maintain capitalist relations. Because you can certainly imagine conditions in which enough working people and enough different kinds of people will rise up and rebel to overturn whoever's in power in order to try something else, right?
Hmm.
So I mean, it seems like what we're describing again when it comes to serving profitability is still like the maintenance of this society rather than
Yeah.
getting beyond it.
Right.
So um, yeah, I'm just gonna. We're about 41 minutes in. What I want to do is start up a conversation that we maybe could take to a second stream if you have a little bit of time to stick
Sure.
around for a patron only
Sure.
podcast. But here's the beginning of it. It seems to me that go back to just the res- response your comments got in that panel in Chicago, and the way that these questions are taken up, or the way they're not taken up. Um, it points to some hesitancy that might have a rationality behind it that isn't spoken. Like, for instance, in this conversation, you and I have not yet spoken deeply enough to know if we actually agree about how to theorize the economy. The history of Marxism is the history of different interpretations. Like someone who might like Paul Sweezy might be the enemy of someone who likes Michael Roberts today, or there are different different theories of prices within capitalism. I mean, within Marxism, there are different theories of value. Um, there's certainly very different theories of crisis, and coming to an agreement about what seem to many to be esoteric economic questions um, might seem to many to be impossible, and you're asking people to do too much. Not only are you asking like every worker who wants to organize politically to read Capital Volume 1, 2, and 3, but you're asking them to have the not only the proper interpretation of that, but the proper interpretation of the Marxist literature that was born out of it. So do you think that the reason why there's so much resistance to your perspective is because understanding the world seems to be an impossible task, especially in light of the history of Marxist debate?
Yeah. So I just say straight out of the gate, if the people who like Roberts and the people who like Sweezy are really enemies, if we're all fucked, right? Because
Right,
we have to be in this together, and what we have to
right.
agree on is we need to understand the world so that we can change it. And yeah, we can't. I mean, the enemy's on the outside. The enemy can't be on the inside of the
Okay,
group. Um,
okay.
yeah. I don't think the solution is that every worker becomes a Marxist intellectual. That would obviously be ludicrous. That's something more like you would get at a DSA meeting, I think, where everyone's up to date on the latest whatever theory and how we do things around here and so forth. And you've got to know. I don't know what. I won't fill in the blanks, but No,
Yeah, you don't want to get canceled. I know where you're going. You know, you have to know all the right pronouns. That's what
well,
you're going to
that,
say.
but not only that. I mean, there's so much stuff. I mean,
Mm.
where to begin? The point would just be that the people who call themselves, so for instance, if you're an organizer, if you are, if you're um, a Marxist intellectual, I don't think it's too much to ask that we, not only read Capital, but maybe also read some financial economics. What's a collateralized debt obligation? What did it have to do with the collapse in 2008?
Mm.
These are things we should know, and so the burden is on the people who who claim to be organizing and claim to be intellectuals more than workers. If we can present a coherent and compelling account, then popular support might be forthcoming, and then maybe something can happen. But until we do that, I don't think we should expect anything. I mean, go to a DSA meeting, you won't find anyone who any manual laborers.
Uh-huh. At all.
Well, okay,
Okay.
maybe some baristas or something. And I'm not just trying to to talk trash about the DSA, but I mean, there are 12 million industrial workers in this country. The situation just isn't like it used to be, and they're not hanging out in DSA meetings. And so, the,
Are they even in cities? Where are they? These industrial workers
probably
in
not so much in
America.
urban areas.
Yeah, they're in rural areas now. Is that right?
Well, I mean, the Rust Belt is where is where there used to be industry. A lot of it's just gone. A lot of it's just gone.
And there's a lot of automation too. But you said 12 million
I
still
googled
here.
it and I saw 12.5 million. I don't know.
Yeah, right.
That could be
Well, no,
false.
no, right, no, right. But I mean, like even within my lifetime, there was an industrial area of downtown Portland,
Mhm.
right? Like in the 90s, there was a beer brewing plant downtown. You could smell it every night.
Mhm.
That's gone. That's gone. So, yeah, I just wonder where the industrial workers are in America. I mean, and if they're not in the major urban areas, then it would make sense that they wouldn't be part of the DSA, right?
Well, there is a lot of DSA activity in rural areas too, or semi-urban. It's different in Chicago. You get apparently different kinds of people turning up. A lot of it's people like me, people who flee the rural areas to go to the urban area, and then you get a bunch of the same kind of people in the meeting. Whereas, if it would be different in a rural DSA meeting. You might not have as many. Millennials, the PMC composition might not be as great, but in the city, it's pretty thick. Um, one thought, though, one thought in relation to the previous discussion we're having, I'll say about what you just said, the change of the composition of the working class in rural and urban areas. One group of people that I'll pick on, for example, like this is meant as criticism. Um, Negri and Hart, around like 2000, we're talking about immaterial labor, and this was really a fad topic. It was really popular in critical theory circles, and is saying, look, it's deindustrializing. We're in a service economy, blah blah. And people were kind of, oh yeah, this is new. This is new. Getting high on this idea of immaterial labor is kind of. But if we look at what's happening, markets were being deregulated. Capital was simply leaving the country. The market had already been financialized. It was becoming incredibly financialized. It was shifting from producing profits by exploiting labor to make commodities to profiting by charging fees or making rents, a rentier style. That's a financialized economy. These are all changes which can perfectly be explained by looking at what's going on in the economy. Um, Neoliberalism deregulating, like in the early 90s, for instance. Soviet Union ends, all of those assets in Russia privatized, sold off for pennies on the dollar to oligarchs. That's why neoliberals don't like socialism, because they want to privatize infrastructure. They want to own it. And so when the industrial composition of America is changing so much that now workers work in service or commercial capital. Maybe now it's Amazon. You deliver products instead of produce them. There's always an economic explanation for why this is the case. We don't need to invent novel concepts like immaterial labor. That might get tenure for an academic, but it won't help people understand what's going on around them.
Mm-hmm.
That's a perfect example. Like you said, in the 90s in Portland downtown, there was an industrial sector. Where to go? There's only one way to find out.
Right. Well, it got monopolized. What happened was Henry Weinhardt's was purchased by I don't know, like Budweiser. I think, yeah, it was Budweiser purchased it. So then the production was centralized wherever they were producing. That's where that production went. So yeah, it was not hard to find out even at the time. We kind of all knew what was happening, but why that was happening is maybe trickier. Listen, rather than start a second stream, let's use this as a breaking point. So from here on out, we're gonna talk a little more informally, although we haven't been being that rigorous so far, but or not too rigorous. But I want to know like how you feel about the left as you encounter it in the Platypus Affiliated Society, as you encounter it in Class Unity. Maybe you can tell me about the Class Unity project and what you think the material reason is, or should we even look for material reason for the kinds of political mistakes that you tried to point to in your panel discussion.